So we are going to continue our study through the book of Ruth, and as we try to put ourselves back into the shoes of Naomi and Ruth and Orpah, as we're continuing to look at chapter 1 to see three different responses to disaster. And as we just sang, victory in Jesus, we, as Naomi and Ruth, were looking for victory. They were looking for relief. We can probably relate to them more now than in other times in our life. But last week, as we began looking at the rest of chapter 1, verses 7 through 22, we saw how Naomi responded to disaster, and how, unlike her, we don't have to give up on the future because of what has happened to us in the past. No matter what has happened behind us, we have a Redeemer. You have a Redeemer. His name is Jesus, and He is on the throne, and He lives. And so this morning we're going to continue to look at Ruth 1. We're going to see how both Orpah and Ruth respond to disaster. And so I want to just reread the passage just to kind of refresh our memories a little bit. So if you turn with me to Ruth chapter 1, we'll start in verse 7. And she left the place where she had been living, accompanied by her two daughters-in-law, and traveled back along the road leading back to the land of Judah. And Naomi said to them, "Each of you go back to your mother's home, and may the Lord show kindness to you, as you have shown to the dead and to me. And may the Lord grant each of us, rest in the house of a new husband." And she kissed them, and they wept loudly. And they said to her, "We insist on returning with you to your people." But Naomi replied, "Return home, my daughters. Why do you want to go with me? Am I able to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. Go on, for I am too old to have another husband. And even if I thought there was still hope for me to have a husband tonight and to bear sons, would you be willing to wait for them to grow up? Would you refrain yourselves from remarrying? No, my daughters, my life is much too bitter for you to share, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." And again they wept loudly, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And we'll stop there for now. So just kind of a recap, the famine hit Bethlehem. There was no bread in Bethlehem. We saw in the first five verses of chapter 1. And so Naomi, with her husband Elimelech and their two children, left Bethlehem. They went to Moab, and there they settled. Their two sons married daughters from the country of Moab, Ruth and Orpah. And then while they were there, Elimelech died, and several years later, both of Naomi's sons died, Mahlon and Chilion. And so that she was left with no husband and no sons, just two daughters-in-law. And so Naomi hears the news in Bethlehem that the famine was coming to an end, that the Lord had stretched out His hand to take care of His people, and now she is planning to return back to Judah, back to Bethlehem. And we pick up there in verse 7, it says she left the place where she'd been living. So Naomi is going back to Bethlehem, and she's accompanied with Ruth and Orpah. And along the way, she's trying to get them to go back to their home in Moab. She pleads with them 3 different times, "Go back home. There's nothing for you. I can't do anything else. Even if I was pregnant tonight, would you really wait for my sons to grow up so that you could marry them? My life is too bitter. There's no hope left for me." And so she's pleading with both Orpah and Ruth to go back to their home so that maybe somehow they can at least salvage their life. Because again, Naomi has lost all hope for the future. And so we see how both Orpah and Ruth respond in verse 14 and 15. And so after Naomi is pleading with them to return, verse 14 says, "They wept loudly, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law." And so she's kissing Naomi because she's taking her mother-in-law's advice to return back to Moab. And so the lesson that we can learn from Orpah is a hard lesson, and that's the lesson to beware, because half-hearted devotion leads to idolatry. Now again, we saw in verse 7 that Orpah starts on this journey with Naomi back to Bethlehem. She's leaving her homeland of Moab, and she's traveling with Naomi to Bethlehem, but on the way she's persuaded by Naomi to return. And so the lure of the known and the comfortable was too much for Orpah, and she returns back home. And we see the consequence of it in verse 15. Naomi said, look, she's talking to Ruth now, as Orpah has already returned, or began to return. Naomi said, look, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. And so Orpah is returning to her people and to her gods. Her unwillingness to follow Naomi with a full heart led her back into a life of idolatry. She went back home where it was comfortable, where it was known, but the result was that she lost her soul. And so I encourage you this morning, don't allow the known and the comfort to persuade you away from wholeheartedly following God. You know, Jesus said in Matthew 16:24, if anyone wants to follow after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. And so Jesus knew that there was a cost involved in discipleship. There was a cost involved in following him. He wanted his disciples to know that up front, that from the world's perspective, following Jesus is not always the safest and wisest decision. But no matter what happens in this life, when you follow Jesus with your whole heart, no matter what you encounter, no matter what you have to endure, it is worth it, because you gain life itself. You gain eternal life. And nothing and no one can take that away. But here in Ruth chapter 1, we see that Orpah wasn't willing to be fully devoted to her mother-in-law, and her half-heartedness led her back into a life of idolatry. And so, and we know this is true from a discipleship standpoint, because Jesus also told us the story, or the parable of the four soils, where the thorny soil did not produce any fruit because of the persecutions of the world. And so Jesus knew that there would be some who would claim to follow him, but would ultimately fall away, or at least not produce any fruit, because of the lure of what is comfortable, because of the lure of what is known, or because of persecutions they may face. And so today it is easier than ever to neglect meeting together. It is easier than ever to neglect following God with your whole heart. We have excuse after excuse to not meet together regularly. But I encourage you that just to continue to do what you've always done. And I'm so thankful for Salem Baptist Church and for those of you who are watching online, because you know that no matter what the world, no matter what is going on around us, it is better to face that wholeheartedly with God at your side than it is to flee somewhere comfortable without him. So even though, and through the gift of technology, we are not alone, we still have a sense of community, even though it is not normal. But again, as we look back into Ruth chapter 1, we finally get to see a small glimmer of hope in how Ruth responds. Even though we don't know how things are going to end for this family, there's a glimmer of hope here in chapter 1. And so I want us to kind of turn our attention now and see how Ruth responds to disaster. We saw how Naomi responded. She thinks her life is too bitter, it's too terrible, that nothing good can happen. Orpah, she's at the crossroad where she can follow Naomi back to a foreign land, or she can return back home where it's known, and she chooses to go back to where it is known and comfortable. But Ruth responds to disaster in a different way. And we see the beginning of it in verse 14. And so again it says they wept loudly, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And so Orpah is kissing Naomi as she begins to return. She's given in to the persuasion from Naomi to return back to her land, but it says Ruth clung to her. She clung to Naomi. And that word there is the same word that is used in Genesis 2 for how a husband clings to his wife. This is a very intimate relationship that Ruth is saying that no matter what happens, I am going to stay with Naomi. She's not giving up. She is going to be faithful regardless of what happens. And so one of the first lessons that we can learn from how Ruth responds to disaster is that she chose to love others more than herself. And so I encourage you, even in times of uncertainty, choose to love others more than yourself. You know, Ruth is very much putting Naomi's needs above her own. It would make sense for her to go back with her sister-in-law. It would make sense for her to go back to Moab, where she can start life over, where she's still young enough to remarry and build a family for herself. But she's not thinking about what is best for her. She is choosing to love others more than herself. She's not taking the easy way out, but is willing to continue to go with Naomi and to serve Naomi, even when things look bleak at best. And another way that we can follow Ruth's example is to choose faithfulness over fullness. You know, Ruth knows that going to Bethlehem, that there's not much hope for her there. It's a foreign country. She doesn't know anyone. The only contact she has there is with Naomi. So that everything in Bethlehem is uncertain. Plus, they're going back into a land that has been ravaged by famine. So there's all these questions that are facing Ruth. But she is choosing to choose faithfulness. She's choosing to be faithful to Naomi over than to choose a life of fullness for herself. And so many times we can be confronted with the same choice. And so I ask you, will you be faithful to God and to do what He has called you to do, even when you may have to sacrifice what is comfortable, even when you may have to sacrifice what is known? Choose to be faithful to God over the fullness that the world can offer. And another lesson that we can learn from Ruth is to choose the true God over false gods. And so before we go any further, let's finish reading the rest of this chapter. We'll pick up in verse 16. And so again, Naomi is still trying to get Ruth to return. She's like, look, your sister has gone back. She's gone back to her people. She's gone back to her gods. But look at what Ruth says in verse 16. Don't plead with me to abandon you or to return and not follow you. Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. And may the Lord punish me and do so severely, if anything but death separates you and me. And so when Naomi saw that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped talking to her. And the two of them traveled until they came to Bethlehem. And we'll read the rest of it here in a few minutes. And so this is Ruth's response. Again, she's choosing to love Naomi more than herself. She's like, wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. Your people will become my people. And then the third lesson is, unlike Orpah, she's not returning to what is known, and she's not returning to her old way of life, her old gods, but she is choosing that Yahweh, the true God, will be her God. She says, your God will be my God. So unlike Orpah, she's not choosing to return to a life of idolatry. She is choosing to embrace the God of Naomi. And she's choosing to value the true God over false gods. And that is a striking statement because we don't really know what Ruth knew of God. The only thing that we know of for certain is how Naomi is talking about God in this chapter. And that doesn't necessarily paint a tremendously positive picture of who God is and what he has done, because Naomi is blaming God for all of his hardship. She's blaming God for she feels like God is punishing her by having her husband die, by having her sons die. And so more than anything else, she is complaining to God. And so we know that Ruth is hearing this, but Ruth still chooses to follow the true God. So we don't know what her husband taught her about Yahweh before he died. We don't know what stories she had heard of the past, of how God had delivered his people. And so we really don't know how much Ruth knew about God. But despite of all of that, she is choosing to believe the little bit that she does know about God more than what she feels, more than what she can see. She has faith that God can bring her and her mother-in-law through. And so again, she had the same opportunity to return as Orpah did, but she is choosing to be faithful not only to Naomi, but she's choosing to be faithful to God. And so I ask each of us today, will you continue to trust God over anything else in life? Some of the false gods that Satan will throw at us and tempt us with, they look appealing, they look luring, they look comfortable and easy. But will you continue to trust God with all of your heart? And another lesson we can learn from Ruth is, it goes along with this, and it's choosing to believe what you know more than what you see or what you feel. And so again, we don't know what experience Ruth had with God. We don't know what she had seen him do in the past, but she's willing to put her faith in him and to continue to follow him based on what she has heard of his character and not what she is experiencing right now. Because she could very easily blame God just as easily as Naomi is. Her husband has also died. She has been left without children. She is left without a husband. And so she could very easily blame the God of Naomi just as Naomi does. But she's choosing to believe what she knows of God, to believe what she knows of his character more than what she feels. And that's not an easy thing to do. And especially in days like today when there's chaos and there's so much uncertainty. Will you continue to believe the God that you know, the truth about God that is written in his word, or will you give in to the fear of the unknown, the fear of how this situation can make you feel? And so we're asking God to grow our church. We're asking God to stop the coronavirus. So how are we going to respond even when it seems like he's not working, even when it seems like our prayers aren't being answered? Will you continue to believe in his character? Will you continue to believe in what he said he will do and who he said he is, even when we can't feel it or see that it is working? Will you continue to believe that God has your best in mind? And then the last lesson I want us to see from how Ruth responds to disaster is that I want you to choose to allow God's control over all. Allow God's sovereignty to give you freedom. So Ruth, it's really interesting just how she responds to all this situation. She's not living, she's not like her sister-in-law who is afraid to go to a new place and returns back home. And she's not like Naomi who is just looking at the future like there is no hope and blaming God, but yet she seems to have this sense of freedom that everything is going to be okay. And she's placing her trust in God, and that gives her a sense of freedom that life will go on. She's not afraid of moving to a new culture. She's not afraid of what's going to happen to her in Bethlehem. She's not afraid of what people are going to say about her. Again, she is a foreigner. And the history between Israel and Moab, sometimes they have a pretty good relationship, but at other times it has been strained. And so she's walking into not only a foreign culture, but in some people are going to see her as a Moabite, as the enemy. And so why is she not afraid to do all of this? And I believe it's because she has put her trust in the Almighty God. And when you put your trust in God, He's going to give you a sense of freedom. Not that everything will be perfect, not that everything is going to go how you plan, but that you are trusting in the perfect Father. As Doug had a good illustration this morning about faith of writing a blank check to God. That really symbolized what Ruth is doing. She is giving her check to God and saying, no matter what happens, I'm trusting you. And that gave her freedom not to respond negatively, not to run back to what is known, but to continue to live in freedom, knowing and trusting that everything will eventually work out for her, even when she doesn't know how in the world it will. And another illustration for this is, Lily and Linton, now that we're still learning our way, we've pretty much figured out how to get around Big Spring, but when we go to Midland or Lubbock or anywhere else, we have no idea where we are. And so we rely heavily on Google Maps. And when they were smaller, they just rode along in the back seat and they trusted us, and they're like, Dad or Mom, they know exactly where we are, they know exactly where we're going, and they had no fear because they felt like we were in control. But now that they're getting older and smarter, they realize that we are relying on our phone and it's giving us directions. And so Lily oftentimes will think, man, Dad really has no idea where he's going. And she starts to get concerned. And it's the same thing can happen to us, that the more we think about it, if we don't have full trust in whoever is driving our life, that fear can kind of creep in. Are they really in control? Do they really know where we are going? And so thankfully, God is a much stronger and much wiser than me when it comes to driving a car and figuring out how to get from one place to the next or how to get home. If we put our trust in Him, He is never going to fail you. And so you can experience the same trust and freedom that Ruth has by just giving all of your concerns and your cares to God. You are safe in His hands. And so how can we apply this? I think there's a few ways that we can apply these lessons from chapter 1. Before we get into that, I want us to read the last few verses here. So verse 19 says, the two of them traveled until they came to Bethlehem. When they entered Bethlehem, the whole town was excited about their arrival. And the local women exclaimed, can this be Naomi? Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, she answered. For the Almighty has made me very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why do you call me Naomi? Since the Lord has opposed me, and the Almighty has afflicted me. And so Naomi came back from the territory of Moab with her daughter-in-law Ruth, the Moabitess, and they arrived in Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. And so when we think about applying this, I think one thing is that is the fact that Naomi returned from Moab to Bethlehem. And so from verse 6, verse 7, Naomi is the driving force. Like, she is the one who is doing the action. She's the one who hears that the famine is coming to an end. She's the one who decides to leave Moab and go back to Bethlehem, and Ruth and Orpah are accompanying her. And then it says in verse 22 that she came back from the territory of Moab. And so she is returning to Bethlehem. And so as I was thinking about this and praying through this, I feel like sometimes it takes a disaster for people to realize that they need to return to God. And right now, with all that is going on in the world, I'm praying that people will have a heightened sensitivity to God and His workings, and really considering in their soul if they have a good relationship with Him. And so for us as believers, we can be like Ruth and not take the easy way out, but continue to be faithful. Continue to point people to God even when things are uncertain. Continue to point people that the most important decision that they can make, and the only truly certain thing that we can know, is that if we have a relationship with Jesus or not. And so I continue to urge you to be like Ruth, to continue to love others more than you love yourself. Continue to choose to be faithful to God more than what the world offers. And your faithfulness will have a direct impact on those around us. The world will see the sense of security and trust and faith that we have. And I believe that is something that is lacking and something that people are hungry for in this day and time. And then another lesson that I think we can apply from this is that both Naomi and Ruth arrived in Bethlehem. It says, the second half of verse 22, it says they arrived in Bethlehem. And this is kind of the first time when the narrator is shifting the focus away from Naomi and is putting more of the spotlight onto Ruth. Now it's not just Naomi who's involved in the action, but it's Ruth as well. They arrived. And that should give us hope in the sense that regardless of where you are, if you relate more to Ruth and you are on fire for God, if you are following him wholeheartedly, that you can arrive back with him, that you can grow even closer to him in your relationship. But if this morning you feel like you relate more with Naomi, you're unsure of why God is allowing things to happen, if you just don't feel like he's working in the way that you feel like he should, and you feel more distant from God, the hope is there that they can both arrive. Regardless of how close or far from God you feel, God is never far from each one of us. He has not left you. He has not abandoned you. And so Ruth arrived in Bethlehem with a radical faith, and Naomi is dragging herself back to Bethlehem with little to no faith. And so regardless of where you are this morning, no matter how great or how much faith you have, the hope is there that you can return to God. That he can heal you from anything that you are facing physically, that he can heal you from any spiritual problem as well. We also see at the very end of verse 22, the end of chapter 1, it says, they arrived in Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. And so there's just this glimmer of hope that every famine will end. Regardless of how hard it seems in the moment, every famine will come to an end. Every famine of spiritual drought will come to an end. We have Jesus Christ, that there's nothing that you can do to make God reject you or love you. The only person who can control whether you return to God or not is yourself. If you are willing to humble yourself and return to him, he will accept you. He will save you from anything that you have done. And famines of physical nature, they will also all come to an end. So there is nothing that God cannot overcome if we are willing, and if you are willing to go to him and give yourself to him. He is waiting for you to return. And so I titled this message that let me get back to it so I say it right. That God's kindness comes from unexpected places. And so as the spotlight is shifting from Naomi to Ruth, Ruth in this story really isn't, when we read about this story, Ruth shouldn't be the one who's responding with the type of radical faith that she is. It should be Naomi. She is from the tribe of Judah. She has all this heritage of knowing who God is, of seeing God respond. But when we read this story, it's not Naomi that's responding with radical faith, it's Ruth. And so the story of Ruth just proves that God's kindness comes sometimes from unexpected places. And I believe that radical faith can change the world, just as Ruth was willing to not trust what she saw and not believe what she felt, but to put her faith in God. she's giving God complete control in her life, and that gave her the freedom to continue to trust him and to know that things will eventually work out. And so that is my prayer for us today, that we would just learn to see how God's kindness sometimes comes through unexpected places. And I pray that God will use us as we minister to others, that we can be those vessels of radical faith, that when we are not afraid of facing the unknown, that God will work miracles through us. And so as we close this morning, I just want you to know, regardless of whether you feel closer to Ruth or closer to Naomi, that you can both arrive at the same place, that God is there for you. He hasn't abandoned you. He hasn't left you. And regardless of how much or how little faith you have, he can and will save. And so let me pray for us this morning.